In the unforgiving moral landscape of the French Revolution, the guillotine did not just punish treason, it punished vice. While history remembers Philippe Égalité primarily as the royal cousin who betrayed the king, his contemporaries knew him by a darker, more dangerous whisper, Sodomite. He was a man who defied the rigid definitions of masculinity, building an empire of forbidden pleasure in the Palais-Royal and navigating the fluid, underground world of queer desire in an age that demanded absolute virility. His eventual destruction was not just political, it was a purge of the unnatural aristocrat. To understand how this prince of the blood became the ultimate scapegoat for the sexual anxieties of a nation, we must return to the very beginning. He was born on April 13th, 1747, at the Château de Saint-Cloud, a palace of white stone and manicured gardens that rivaled Versailles in its splendor. From the moment he drew his first breath, he was an object of intense scrutiny. He was the Duc de Chartres, the heir to the House of Orléans, the cadet branch of the ruling Bourbon dynasty. In the rigid hierarchy of the Ancien Régime, the Orléans family occupied a unique and perilous position. They were the eternal understudies, the cousins waiting in the wings. If the main line of the royal family failed, if the king died without a son, the throne would pass to them. This proximity to ultimate power bred a hereditary culture of ambition, resentment, and a desperate need to distinguish themselves from the dull, dutiful monarchs at Versailles. But the boy born in 1747 was also born into a domestic war. His father, Louis-Philippe I, was a man of crippling contradictions. Outwardly, he was the picture of a grand seigneur, but inwardly, he was consumed by a neurotic, trembling piety. He was obsessed with his own salvation, terrified of hellfire, and viewed the pleasures of the flesh with a mixture of fascination and horror. He spent hours in prayer, surrounded by priests, begging forgiveness for sins he mostly imagined. He was a man who wanted to be a monk, but was forced by birth to be a prince. His mother, however, was a force of nature. Louise Henriette de Bourbon-Conti was a woman who treated the Ten Commandments as mild suggestions. She was beautiful, sharp-witted, and ferociously bored by her pious, trembling husband. While the Duke prayed in his chapel, the Duchess ruled the salons. She was a libertine in the truest sense of the word, believing that the pursuit of pleasure was the only rational response to the absurdity of life. Her affairs were not just whispered rumors, they were public spectacles. She took lovers from the ranks of the nobility, the military, and scandalously the lower orders. This dichotomy defined Philippe's existence before he could even speak. He was the product of a holy father and a profane mother, a living battleground between repression and excess. And there were whispers that would haunt him for the rest of his life, that he was not, in fact, an Orleans at all. Decades later, when the revolution was tearing down the statues of kings, Philippe himself would allegedly claim in a moment of cynical political maneuvering that he was actually the son of a handsome coachman his mother had fancied, rather than the pious duke. Whether this was a true confession or a lie, told to distance himself from the royal bloodline, is lost to history. The rumor itself tells us everything about the atmosphere of his childhood. He grew up in a house where legitimacy was questionable, where authority was mocked, and where the only consistent truth was the pursuit of desire. As a child, Philippe was physically delicate, but intellectually voracious. He was not raised by his parents. Aristocratic children rarely were, but by a retinue of governesses and tutors. The most influential of these was the Chevalier de Bonnard, a man of the Enlightenment, a soldier and a poet who believed in a modern, softer form of education. Bonnard did not beat the boy. He charmed him. He taught Philippe to question tradition, to value reason over dogma, and to appreciate the sensual beauty of the world. Under Bonnard's tutelage, Philippe read the scandalous philosophical tracts that were circulating in Paris. He learned that the absolute monarchy was a decaying relic, and that the church was often an instrument of control rather than salvation. But Bonnard also noticed something else in the young prince. In his letters to the Duke, Bonnard described Philippe as having a precocious sensibility, a polite 18th century euphemism for a child who was intensely aware of his own body and the bodies of others. Philippe was tactile, affectionate, and prone to intense, overwhelming attachments. In the segregated world of aristocratic boyhood, where young men were raised almost exclusively in the company of other young men, these attachments flourished. At the age of 15, the crisis came. The education of a prince was a carefully choreographed performance intended to produce a miniature version of the king. Philippe was sent to the Collège de Juilly, a prestigious academy run by the Oratorian Fathers. It was meant to polish him, to give him the final veneer of Catholic respectability. Instead, it provided the setting for his first great fall. Boarding schools in the 18th century were hotbeds of hormonal experimentation. Cut off from women and confined in close quarters, students often formed particular friendships. For most, these were passing phases, emotional anchors in a lonely environment. But for Philippe, Juilly was an awakening. He found himself drawn not to the abstract ideals of military glory or statecraft, but to the tangible reality of his classmates. In 1763, a scandal erupted that was quickly smothered by the immense weight of the Orléans machinery. The details were expunged from the official records, leaving only jagged holes in the archives where the disciplinary reports should be. But the gossip at Versailles was unstoppable. The young Duc de Chartres had been caught. It wasn't just a matter of holding hands or exchanging poetic letters. He had been discovered in a physical act with another student. To understand the gravity of this, one must realize that sodomy was still a capital crime in France. A commoner caught in such an act could be burned at the stake or broken on the wheel. A prince, of course, would never face such a fate, but the social death could be just as devastating. The Italian vice, as it was known, was considered a mark of weakness, of effeminacy, of a man unfit to lead armies or sire dynasties. For a boy who was third in line to the throne, it was catastrophic. His father was horrified. The pious duke saw the devil's work in his son's desires. His mother, the libertine duchess, was likely less shocked by the morality of the act than by the clumsiness of getting caught. The solution, arrived at by the family council, was the standard remedy for all aristocratic indiscretions: marriage. They needed to normalize him. They needed to prove to the king and the court that Philippe was a virile, red-blooded male capable of perpetuating the line. And so the hunt for a bride began. It was not a search for a soulmate. It was a search for a shield. The negotiations took years during which Philippe removed from Juilly and returned to the permissive atmosphere of the Palais-Royal, began to explore his identity with a mixture of defiance and shame. He was 16, then 17, then 18. He was handsome in a heavy-lidded, sensual way, with the famous bourbon nose and a complexion that flushed easily. He began to frequent the opera balls, hiding behind a mask, observing the fluid, chaotic world of Parisian nightlife. It was during these twilight years of his adolescence that the police reports, the famous fiches of the Lieutenant General of Police, began to track him. The Parisian police were the most sophisticated intelligence agency in Europe. They knew everything. They knew which actress was sleeping with which minister which priest was losing money at the card tables, and which prince was venturing into the darker alleys. The inspectors noted that the young Duc de Chartres was restless. He would visit the salons of fashionable courtesans, performing the role of the dashing young rake, but then he would vanish. He was seen in the company of men known to be of the confraternity, the coded language for the subculture of sodomites that thrived in the shadows of the capital. He was testing the waters, dipping a toe into a world that offered a terrifying kind of freedom. But the cage of duty was closing in. By 1768, his father had found the perfect candidate for marriage, Louise Marie Adélaïde de Bourbon-Penthièvre. She was the polar opposite of Philippe in every conceivable way. She was the granddaughter of Louis XIV through an illegitimate line, which made her royal enough, but her primary attraction was her staggering wealth. She was the sole heiress to the vast fortune of the Duc de Penthièvre, the richest private citizen in France. Louise Marie Adélaïde was a creature of pure innocence. Raised in a convent atmosphere, she was deeply religious, gentle, and terrified of the world. She had been taught that a wife's duty was submission and procreation. When she was presented to Philippe, she fell instantly, hopelessly in love with him. He was dazzling to her, worldly, witty, and carrying the dangerous allure of a man who knew secrets she couldn't even imagine. Philippe's reaction to her was more complex. He did not love her. Aristocrats rarely expected to love their spouses, but he was not cruel. He saw her as a vessel, a means to an end. Acquiring her fortune would make him independent of his father and independent of the king. It would give him the funds to build his own world, a world where he wouldn't have to hide. The wedding took place at Versailles in April 1769. It was the social event of the decade. The Hall of Mirrors reflected the light of 4,000 candles, multiplying the diamonds and the silks until the eyes ached. Philippe stood at the altar, 22 years old, draped in the blue ribbon of the Order of the Holy Spirit. He spoke his vows with a steady voice, promising to forsake all others. The court watched with cynical amusement. They knew the Orléans reputation. They knew the bride was a lamb being fed to a wolf, but they didn't realize that the wolf was also trapped. The wedding night was a disaster of mismatched expectations. Louise Marie Adélaïde expected a spiritual union. Philippe performed a physical duty. He did what was required. He consummated the marriage, ensuring that the legal contract was binding. But almost immediately, the facade began to crack. Within weeks of the wedding, Philippe was bored. The domestic tranquility that his wife craved was suffocating to him. He had done his duty. He had secured the fortune. Now he wanted his reward. He returned to Paris, leaving his pregnant wife at the Château de Saint-Cloud, and plunged headfirst into the libertine whirlwind. But this was no longer the tentative exploration of a teenager. Now, he was a married man of immense means. He began to construct a double life of staggering complexity. By day, he was the Duc de Chartres, attending royal councils, hunting with the king and appearing at official functions with his adoring, unhappy wife. By night, he was the master of the Palais-Royal. The Palais-Royal at this time was still the old palace of Richelieu, a rambling, somewhat dilapidated complex of gardens and galleries. But Philippe saw its potential. He saw it as a sanctuary. He began to gather around him a coterie of friends who shared his tastes. This was not just about sex, it was about sensibility. He surrounded himself with Anglophiles, freethinkers, and men who rejected the stiff, formal etiquette of Versailles. His relationship with the Chevalier de Coigny during this period is telling. Coigny was a dashing cavalry officer, known for his wit and his beauty. They were inseparable. They rode together, gambled together, and vanished for days on end to small hunting lodges in the countryside. The letters they exchanged were burned, but the observations of the court were preserved. They are like Castor and Pollux, one courtier noted. If Castor and Pollux were less interested in fighting and more interested in pleasure. It is here, in the early 1770s, that we see the formation of Philippe's specific type of sexuality. It was not the exclusive homosexuality of the modern definition. Philippe genuinely enjoyed women. He had famous affairs with ladies of the court, most notably the Countess of Genlis, who would become the governess of his children and the intellectual architect of the next generation. But his relationships with women were often intellectual or performative. They were public affairs conducted for the gallery. His relationships with men were different. They were private, visceral, and fraught with risk. In a society where appearance was everything, the only place one could be truly naked, literally and metaphorically, was in the dark. Philippe began to crave that darkness. He discovered that his rank allowed him to break boundaries that others couldn't. He began to patronize the brothels disguised as a common bourgeois, partly for the thrill of the masquerade, but partly to experience a world where he was just a body, not a title. The police reports from the 1770s show a man increasingly addicted to risk. He was spotted in the Tuileries Gardens at night, a notorious cruising ground. He was seen entering the private rooms of gambling dens where the stakes were not money, but favors. One specific incident from 1772 illustrates the incredible tightrope he was walking. A police raid on a house in the Rue Saint-Honoré detained a group of men dressed as women. Among the names listed in the initial report, before being hastily scratched out and replaced with unknown, was a description that matched the Duc de Chartres perfectly. The police commissioner, a man named Lenoir, knew better than to arrest the king's cousin. The report was buried, but the knowledge was stored. This was the currency of the Ancien Régime, information. Every sin was noted, every indiscretion catalogued, ready to be used as leverage. Philippe thought he was free because he wasn't being arrested. He didn't realize he was merely accruing a debt that would eventually be called in. As the 1770s wore on, the contrast between his public image and his private reality became grotesque. To the public, he was a dashing, slightly rebellious prince who snubbed the unpopular King Louis XV and his mistress, Madame du Barry. He was popular in Paris because he was seen as an enemy of the court faction. The people cheered him when his carriage passed, seeing him as a symbol of opposition. They didn't know that the man they cheered was leading a life that, by their own moral standards, was abominable. And then in 1774, everything changed. Louis XV died of smallpox. His grandson, Louis XVI, ascended the throne. Louis XVI was young, awkward, and painfully virtuous. He was a faithful husband, a devoted father, and a man who was physically repulsed by libertinage. He looked at his cousin Philippe, flamboyant, cynical, and surrounded by rumors of sodomy, and he felt nothing but disgust. The new king banished Philippe from the inner circle of power. He refused to give him the naval command he coveted. He froze him out of the policy-making decisions. Philippe, wounded and humiliated, retreated to his stronghold in Paris. If he could not be a powerful prince at Versailles, he decided he would be the king of Paris. He turned his attention back to the Palais-Royal. He looked at the gardens, the crumbling walls, and he had a vision. He would tear it down and rebuild it. He would create a city within a city, a monument to liberty and libertinage. He would build the arcades. This construction project which began in earnest in the late 1770s, was the physical manifestation of Felipe's psyche. The architecture itself was designed for pleasure. The long covered galleries were open to the public, filled with luxury shops, cafes, and clubs. But the design also included countless back exits, hidden staircases, and mezzanine apartments. It was a machine designed for anonymity. It was during the construction of this empire of vice that Philippe met the man who would arguably become the great, tragic love of his life. Not a casual encounter in the Tuileries, not a paid companion, but a peer. That man was Joseph Boulogne, the chevalier de Saint-Georges. To the uninitiated, their pairing seemed impossible. Philippe was the premier peer of the realm, white, wealthy beyond measure, and steeped in the lazy arrogance of his bloodline. Saint-Georges was the illegitimate son of a French planter and an enslaved Senegalese woman, a mulatto in the parlance of the time, who had risen against all odds to become the greatest fencer in France and a virtuoso violinist and composer. They met not in a ballroom, but on the fencing floor. The fencing hall was one of the few places in the Ancien Régime where rank could be temporarily suspended in favor of skill. There, sweating behind wire masks, the prince and the chevalier engaged in a dance of violence and grace that captivated the court. They became inseparable. Saint-Georges moved into the Palais-Royal, occupying apartments within the prince's private wing. While historians have debated the precise nature of their physical intimacy, the emotional reality was undeniable. Saint-Georges was everything Philippe wished to be: talented, self-made, and fiercely independent. In the company of Saint-Georges, Philippe found an escape from the suffocating etiquette of Versailles. They rode together through the Bois de Boulogne. They attended the opera, where Saint-Georges' concertos were played, and late at night, they retreated to the private salons of the Palais-Royal. It was a relationship that defied every social convention of the 18th century. A royal duke and a mixed-race commoner living in open domesticity. To the scandal-hungry public, it was further proof of Philippe's eccentricity. To the police spies watching from the shadows, it was something more dangerous: a deliberate subversion of the social order. The report from Inspector Goupil in 1778 noted with dry suspicion, "The Duke is rarely seen without the Chevalier. They share a familiarity that shocks the court. It is said they share more than just a love of the foil." This friendship was the catalyst for Philippe's growing Anglomania. Saint-Georges was an admirer of England, a country perceived by the French liberals as a land of liberty. Philippe, desperate for a new identity, latched onto this. If France rejected him, he would become English in spirit. In the late 1770s and early 1780s, Philippe began to make frequent trips to London. It was an unprecedented move. French princes did not travel. They stayed at Versailles and orbited the Sun King. But Philippe crossed the Channel and discovered a world that felt like home. London was loud, dirty, commercial, and decidedly masculine. It was the era of the Regency bucks, of bare-knuckle boxing, of heavy drinking, and of private clubs where men could gather without the presence of women. Philippe was intoxicated by it. He was introduced to the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, Prinny, a young man who was practically his mirror image, estranged from a disapproving father, addicted to luxury, and sexually voracious. The friendship between the Duc de Chartres and the Prince of Wales became the axis of a new international libertine network. Together, they spent nights tearing through the brothels of Covent Garden and the gambling hells of St. James. Yet, rumors persisted that Philippe ventured further into the shadows alone, frequenting the molly houses near the brutal executions of Tyburn, places even the prince wouldn't dare to tread. It was in London that Philippe learned the art of the open secret. The English aristocracy had perfected the ability to lead double lives behind the closed doors of their clubs. Philippe brought this architecture of privacy back to Paris. He returned with English jockeys, English tailors, English horses, and an English attitude, a disdain for the theatrical politeness of the French court, and a preference for a more brutal, direct form of pleasure. He brought back something else too, the concept of the club. In 1782, upon the death of his father, Philippe finally became the Duc d'Orléans. He now had absolute control over the family fortune. He accelerated the construction of the Palais-Royal, transforming it into a monument to his new English-inspired philosophy. The new Palais-Royal was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. It was a city of stone arcades enclosing a vast garden, but it was the use of the space that was revolutionary. Philippe declared that the gardens were open to the public, all the public. Aristocrats, bourgeois, and laborers mixed freely. And because it was royal property, the police were barred from entering. This legal loophole turned the Palais-Royal into a pressure cooker of vice. By 1784, it was the sex capital of the world. The geography of the garden became a coded map of desire. The Galerie de Bois, the wooden gallery, nicknamed the Camp of the Tartars, was the domain of lower-class female prostitutes. But the stone arcades, particularly the darker corners near the Café de Foix, became the known territory of the anti-physiciens, the 18th century term for sodomites. Philippe didn't just own the building, he participated in the ecosystem. He kept a private apartment on the ground floor with a hidden door leading directly into the gardens. Police reports from the mid-1780s paint a picture of a prince who moved like a ghost through his own creation. One particularly vivid report from May 1784 describes a tall figure in a heavy gray cloak, moving through the arcades at 2 a.m., stopping to speak with known young men of the trade. The spy, terrified of making a false accusation but eager to report the truth, adds, "The gait was unmistakable. It was Monseigneur." It was during these years that the rumors of the secte des Anandrines, sect of the androgyne, began to circulate. This remains one of the darkest and most disputed chapters of Philippe's life. The rumors, fueled by underground pamphlets, claimed that a secret society met in the sub-basements of the Palais-Royal. According to the whispers, this sect was not just a sex club, but a philosophical movement. They supposedly worshipped a statue of a hermaphroditic deity. New members were initiated through rituals that involved cross-dressing and acts of sodomy intended to shatter the chains of convention. The pamphlets claimed that the Grand Master of this order was none other than Philippe himself. While no membership lists survive, the existence of such libertine societies was a documented fact of pre-revolutionary Paris. The Société des Amis des Noirs, a legitimate abolitionist group Philippe later joined, was often conflated in the public imagination with these darker erotic cabals. The public began to see Philippe not just as a libertine, but as the high priest of a terrifying new morality. But Philippe's most significant relationship in the 1780s was not with a man, but with a woman who facilitated his entire lifestyle, Félicité de Genlis. Madame de Genlis is one of the most fascinating figures of the 18th century. Brilliant, pedantic, and fiercely ambitious, she began as Philippe's lover but quickly realized that sexual power was fleeting. She transitioned into the role of intellectual guide and shockingly was appointed governor of Philippe's male children, a post historically reserved for men. Genlis was the architect of the Orléans faction. She despised the decadence of Versailles and pushed Philippe toward liberal politics. But she also understood his nature. She knew he could not be faithful to her or anyone else. Instead of fighting his desires, she managed them. She took control of his household, pushing his long-suffering wife, the Duchess, into the background. Genlis created a strange, hermetic world at the Château de Bellechasse, where Philippe's children were raised. Meanwhile, she turned a blind eye to Philippe's nocturnal wanderings in the Palais-Royal. In fact, some historians argue she encouraged them. As long as Philippe was busy with his boys and actresses in the arcades, he was not falling under the influence of a rival political mistress. She preferred him to be a debauched libertine rather than a politically compromised husband. Under Genlis's influence, Philippe's bisexuality became compartmentalized. To the world of the Enlightenment, he was the liberal prince, educating his children in the spirit of Rousseau. To the night world of Paris, he was the voracious consumer of bodies. The two halves of his life were drifting further apart, held together only by his immense wealth. But the wealth was not infinite. By 1787, Philippe was facing a crisis. His lavish lifestyle, the construction of the Palais-Royal, and his massive allowances to his favorites had drained the treasury. He was deeply in debt. This financial desperation drove him further into opposition against the king. He needed the monarchy to be reformed not just for ideology, but because he needed to break the financial stranglehold of the court. He began to surround himself with men who were dangerous: radical writers, disgruntled lawyers, and ambitious demagogues. Among these new associates was Carlos de Laclos, the author of Dangerous Liaison. Laclos was hired as Philippe's secretary. It was a match made in hell. Laclos was a cold, calculating genius who viewed human relationships as a game of power and manipulation. In Philippe, he saw the ultimate weapon, a prince with no moral compass who could be used to shatter the monarchy. Laclos is often credited with weaponizing Philippe's reputation. He realized that Philippe's libertinage, which made him a pariah at Versailles, could make him a hero in Paris. The common people didn't care if the Duke slept with men. They cared that he hated the Queen, Marie Antoinette, and Philippe hated Marie Antoinette. Their feud was legendary. The Queen, with her Austrian upbringing and rigid sense of protocol, found Philippe's lifestyle repulsive. She had famously snubbed him at balls, turning her back when he approached. She referred to him in private as that monster. Philippe retaliated through the only channel available to him, the gutter press. The Palais-Royal became the headquarters for the production of pornographic libelles attacking the Queen. It is one of history's great ironies that the man accused of sodomy was the primary financier of the pamphlets accusing the Queen of lesbianism. The libelle wars of the late 1780s were brutal. Philippe's presses churned out stories about the Queen's orgies, her affairs with her brother-in-law, and her insatiable greed. He was projecting his own lifestyle onto her, muddying the water so thoroughly that the truth became irrelevant. But as the political temperature rose, the atmosphere in the Palais-Royal changed. It was no longer just a pleasure garden. It was becoming a forum for revolution. The cafes where men had once cruised for sex were now filled with men arguing about the rights of man. Philippe stood at the center of this vortex, a strange sphinx-like figure. He was 40 years old now. His face was blotchy from drink and the skin condition that plagued the Bourbons. He was losing his hair. The precarious prince was becoming the citizen prince. In 1788, the king attempted to exile Philippe to one of his country estates after a particularly heated confrontation in the Parlement of Paris. It was a fatal mistake. The exile turned Philippe into a martyr. When he returned to Paris, crowds cheered him. They threw flowers at his carriage. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Philippe thought he could have it all. He thought he could be the libertine of the night and the hero of the day. He thought the revolution would be a party, a grand masquerade, where the old rules were burned and a new, freer world would emerge, a world where his desires would no longer be crimes. He did not see the trap closing around him. He did not realize that the very people he was funding, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers, the austere Republicans, despised him more than they despised the king. To Robespierre, a man who slept in a simple room and drank only water, Philippe d'Orléans was not an ally. He was a symptom of the disease they were trying to cure. The year 1789 arrived with the force of a hurricane. The Estates General were summoned. The Ancien Régime was collapsing. And in the gardens of the Palais-Royal, amidst the prostitutes and the gamblers, a young man named Camille Desmoulins stood on a table and shouted the call to arms that would lead to the storming of the Bastille. Philippe was not there that day. He was, characteristically, at a mistress's house in Saint-Cloud. But it was his garden, his money, and his protection that made the explosion possible. As the Bastille fell, Philippe was thrust into the position of a potential king. The mob shouted, "Long live Orléans!" There was a very real possibility that Louis XVI would be deposed and Philippe installed as a constitutional monarch. But Philippe hesitated. At the crucial moment, when power was within his grasp, he faltered. Why? Some historians argue it was cowardice, but perhaps it was something deeper. Perhaps at his core, Philippe knew he was unfit. He knew that a king lives in a glass house. He knew that if he took the throne, the secrets of the Palais-Royal could no longer be secrets. The scrutiny would be absolute. There is a story from this period, likely apocryphal, but psychologically true, that sums up his dilemma. A delegation of supporters came to him, urging him to seize the crown. Philippe listened, swirling a glass of wine, and then replied, "I am not made to govern. I am made to enjoy." He chose enjoyment. He chose the shadows. And in doing so, he surrendered his destiny to men who did not believe in enjoyment. The summer of 1789 was a fever dream. The great fear swept the countryside. Aristocrats began to flee, becoming émigrés. The Polignacs, the king's brothers, the conservative nobility, they all packed their carriages and ran for the borders. Philippe stayed. He walked the streets of Paris without guards. He wore the tricolor cockade. He rebranded himself. He was no longer His Serene Highness. He was a citizen. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. As the press became free, the attacks became wilder. The royalist press, now fighting for its life, targeted Philippe with a venom that makes modern tabloids look tame. They published cartoons showing Philippe engaging in orgies with devils. They published The Private Life of the Duc d'Orléans, a serial that mixed truth with grotesque fantasy. They detailed his Italian habits. They claimed he had corrupted the Dauphin. They claimed he had turned the Palais-Royal into a new Sodom to bring down the wrath of God on France. Philippe read these attacks. He saw the caricatures of himself, naked, bloated, and debauched, and he did something remarkable. He laughed. He dismissed them as the desperate cries of a dying order. He told his friends, "Let them bark. I am the one who holds the leash." He was wrong. The leash had snapped. In October 1789, the women of Paris marched on Versailles. They dragged the king and queen back to Paris, imprisoning them in the Tuileries Palace. The monarchy was effectively over. Philippe was accused of orchestrating the march. The court claimed they saw his agents in the crowd, disguised as women, directing the violence. The king's cousin was now the king's jailer. The government, fearing Philippe's influence, sent him on a convenient diplomatic mission to London. It was a soft exile. He spent most of 1790 in England, back in the comforting arms of the Prince of Wales, back in the molly houses of London, watching from afar as France descended into chaos. He should have stayed there. He could have lived out his days as a wealthy exile, holding court in a London townhouse, growing old and fat and happy. His friends begged him to stay. The British government offered him asylum. But Philippe was addicted to the drama. He missed the electricity of Paris. He missed the Palais-Royal. And tragically, he believed his own press. He believed he was the prince of the people. He returned to France in late 1790. The atmosphere had curdled. The joy of 1789 was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. The Jacobin Club was rising. Philippe joined the Jacobins. It was a surreal sight. The descendant of Louis XIV sitting on a wooden bench next to butchers and lawyers, listening to speeches about the evils of aristocracy. He tried to blend in. He stopped powdering his hair. He wore plain wool coats, but he couldn't hide his body. He carried himself like a prince. He smelled like a prince. And to the hard-eyed men of the Jacobin Club, he smelled like prey. He began to purge his household. He fired his noble servants. He distanced himself from his wife, who was horrified by the revolution. He pushed away anyone who reminded the public of his past. Anyone, that is, except for his male favorites. Even as the noose tightened, Philippe could not give up his core pleasures. The police reports from 1791 and 1792 show that he continued to see young men. He was more discreet, yes. The meetings moved from the Palais-Royal to safe houses in the suburbs, but the compulsion was stronger than the fear. It was a fatal blindness. He didn't understand that the revolution was becoming a moral crusade. The new republic was to be a republic of virtue. Virtue meant austerity, heterosexual family units, and patriotic duty. Vice was counter-revolutionary. By 1792, the monarchy fell completely. The republic was declared. The king was put on trial. And Philippe faced the ultimate test. He was elected to the National Convention under the name Philippe Égalité. He sat on the mountain, the radical left wing of the assembly, surrounded by men who wanted him dead. He thought that if he voted with them, if he proved he was more radical than Robespierre, he would be safe. The trial of Louis XVI began in December 1792. It was a somber, terrifying spectacle. The deputies were called one by one to the rostrum to cast their votes. Guilt or innocence? Death or imprisonment? Philippe knew the eyes of history were on him. He knew that voting for the death of his cousin would be a crime against his blood, a crime against the ancient code of honor that he had been raised to uphold. But he also knew that voting for mercy would be seen as a sign of weakness, of aristocratic sympathy. He calculated. He weighed his soul against his survival. On January 16, 1793, the hall was packed. The candles flickered in the smoky air. The name Philippe Égalité was called. He rose from his seat. The silence was absolute. He walked to the tribune. His face was pale, his eyes dead. He unfolded a piece of paper and read, in a monotone voice, "Solely occupied with my duty, convinced that all who have attacked or shall attack the sovereignty of the people deserve death, I vote for death." The reaction was not applause. It was a shudder. A murmur of revulsion swept through the room. Even the most radical Jacobins were disgusted. A son of France killing the father of the nation. It was parricide. And from the shadows of the gallery, a voice cut through the murmur. It was not a political slogan. It was a sneer from the past. "Sardanapalus," someone shouted. Philippe sat down. He had bought his life, he thought. He had paid for it with the king's blood. But the payment was rejected. By voting for death, he had destroyed his only protection. To the Royalists, he was a monster who had to be destroyed. To the Republicans, he was a traitor who had sold out his own family to save his skin, and a man who would surely sell out the Republic next. He was alone. His friends had fled or were dead. Madame de Genlis had escaped to Switzerland. The Palais-Royal was no longer his sanctuary. It was a public space, filled with spies watching his every move. And the rumors of the Italian vice began to mutate. They were no longer just whispers of debauchery. Now, in the hysteria of 1793, they became accusations of a vast predatory conspiracy. The pamphlets claimed that Egalité was not just sleeping with men, he was organizing a league of sodomites to infiltrate the convention and corrupt the purity of the revolution from within. The logic was twisted but effective. The Republic is masculine and virile. Egalité is effeminate and unnatural. Therefore, Egalité is the anti-Republic. In April 1793, the blow fell. A general, Dumouriez, defected to the Austrians. Dumouriez was a friend of Philippe's son, the future Louis Philippe. It was the excuse the Jacobins needed. The warrant was signed. They came for him at the Palais-Royal. He was eating dinner with his latest mistress, Madame de Buffon. He didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved. He was taken to the Abbé prison, then transferred to Marseille. For months he sat in a damp cell, listening to the sea, waiting for the end. He wrote letters that were never delivered. He asked for news of his children. He asked for wine. In October, as the terror reached its peak, he was brought back to Paris. The Conciergerie prison was known as the antechamber of the guillotine. No one ever left it alive. His trial was a farce. It lasted 20 minutes. He was accused of conspiring to restore the monarchy, of hoarding grain, of corresponding with the enemy. He answered with a weary dignity. He denied everything. But the prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, didn't need evidence. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to cleanse the Republic of its last royal stain. As the sentence of death was read, Philippe Égalité smiled. It was a small, sad smile. He turned to the guards and made a request. He asked for a chaotic, lavish breakfast. Oysters, cutlets, fine wine. He wanted one last taste of the pleasure he had worshipped. He ate with gusto, sharing the wine with the jailers. He joked. He seemed, for the first time in years, truly free. The breakfast was cleared away. The door opened again. It was not a waiter this time. It was Henri Sanson, the public executioner of Paris. He carried a pair of shears and a length of rope. This was the ritual known as the toilette des condamnés, the grooming of the condemned. Philippe did not flinch. He stood up, turned his back, and allowed the executioner to cut the hair at the nape of his neck. It was a practical necessity to ensure the blade of the guillotine would not be obstructed, but for a man who had spent 40 years obsessing over fashion, wigs, and appearance, it was a final brutal stripping of his identity. When Sanson moved to bind his hands, Philippe made a small gesture of impatience. He held his wrists out, presenting them with the ease of a man offering his hand to be kissed at a ball. He was determined to treat this entire proceeding as a tedious formality. They led him out of the conciergerie and into the Cour du Mai. The air was biting cold. The tumbril, a simple open cart used for hauling manure or hay, was waiting. Philippe climbed in. He was not alone. There were other prisoners destined for the blade that day, but the crowd had eyes only for him. He stood tall, towering over the guards. He was dressed with shocking elegance for a man about to die. A green frock coat with large lapels, a pristine white pique vest, tight breeches of yellow buckskin, and polished boots. He looked like he was going to a hunt, not a funeral. As the cart lurched forward, exiting the prison gates and turning onto the Pont au Change, the roar of the city hit him. Paris had turned out in force. The bridges, the quays, and the windows of every building along the route were packed with spectators. But this was not the cheering crowd of 1789 that had hailed him as a savior. This was a mob hungry for closure. The journey from the prison to the Place de la Révolution usually took about an hour. It was a slow, agonizing procession designed to humiliate the victim. As the cart rattled over the cobblestones, the insults began to rain down. They were specific, vicious, and relentless. Monster. Traitor. Where is your money now, Egalité? But cutting through the political insults were the sexual ones, the accusations that had stained his reputation for decades. Sodomite, screamed a woman from the steps of a church. Go back to your boys in hell, shouted a man waving a pike. The crowd threw mud and rotten vegetables. Philippe remained impassive. He looked at them with a heavy-lidded aristocratic boredom that only enraged them further. He seemed to be saying without speaking a word, I created you, I fed you, and now you bore me. Then, the procession took a cruel, deliberate detour. Instead of going straight down the Rue Saint-Honoré, the driver steered the cart toward the Palais-Royal. It was a piece of psychological torture orchestrated by the authorities. They wanted him to see his creation one last time. The cart stopped directly in front of the great iron gates of the palace. Philippe looked up. He saw the magnificent stone arcades he had built, the galleries where he had walked with Saint-Georges, the windows of the apartments where he had entertained his mistresses and his lovers. He saw the Café de Foix, the epicenter of the revolution he had financed. And he saw something else. Scrawled across the facade of his ancestral home, in large, crude letters, were the words, National Property. For the first time, his mask slipped. Witnesses reported that his face drained of color. His hands, bound behind his back, clenched. The Palais-Royal was not just a building. It was his physical body, his externalized soul. It was the only place on earth where he had been truly free to be himself, to indulge his dual nature as a prince and a libertine. Now the Republic had seized it, just as they were about to seize his life. He stared at it for a long moment, his eyes watering, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from grief, and then he turned his head away. Drive on, he muttered. It is finished. The cart rumbled onto the Rue Royale and finally entered the vast open expanse of the Place de la Révolution. In the center stood the machine. The guillotine was painted red. The ground beneath it was dark and sodden. Philippe was the last to die. He had to watch the others climb the steps, had to hear the heavy thud of the blade and the cheer of the crowd. When his turn came, he leaped down from the cart with a surprising agility. He ran up the steps of the scaffold. On the platform, the executioner's assistants moved to remove his boots. It was standard procedure. The boots were valuable and the executioners had the right to claim the clothes of the dead. But Philippe shook his head. He looked at the executioner, Sanson, and spoke his final words. They were not a prayer, nor a political statement. They were a flash of his old, impatient, imperious self. Don't bother, he said, gesturing to his boots. They will come off easier when I am dead. Let us make haste. He lay face down on the plank, the wooden collar, the lunette, clamped around his neck. He stared down into the basket that waited for his head. For a split second, did he think of his children? Did he think of the throne he almost had? Or did he think of the warm, smoky nights in the arcades of the Palais-Royal, the touch of a lover's hand, the scent of perfume and sweat? We will never know. The blade fell. The executioner lifted the head of Louis-Philippe Joseph, Duc d'Orléans, by the hair and showed it to the people. A roar went up, a mixture of triumph and horror. The precarious prince, the citizen equality, was dead. He was 46 years old. The death of Philippe Égalité on the scaffold did not mark the end of the conflict. but rather ignited a prolonged war over his memory. While the restored royalists branded him a treacherous Judas, the Republicans viewed him as an embarrassing stain on the revolution. Both sides sought to erase the evidence of his complex private life by sealing archives and burning correspondence. Yet, history found a way to speak through the surviving police files of the Ancien Régime. The cold, bureaucratic notes of 18th century spies, particularly a 1779 report by Inspector Kedor, vividly sketched a prince who frequented secret rendezvous with male opera singers and underground societies, acting not as a violent predator, but as a consensual participant in the subterranean world of Parisian pleasure. Contemporary rumors attacked not only his sexuality, but his transgression of class boundaries, accusing him of seeking intimacy with stable boys and the lower orders, acts viewed as a defilement of royal dignity. Despite his family's desperate attempts to sanitize his image, rare surviving letters reveal a naked, romantic desire for men. His decision to entrust his sons to a female governess, breaking with tradition, appears in hindsight as a father's attempt to shield them from the predatory abuses of the aristocratic male education he had personally endured. Even the exaggerated rumors of the sect of the androgynes, allegedly worshipping bisexuality, reflected Philippe's disdain for rigid gender roles, a fluidity that the revolution eventually weaponized to condemn him as a traitor lacking patriotic virility. This scandalous legacy became a haunting specter for his son, Louis Philippe, the future citizen king. Deeply traumatized by his father's execution, Louis Philippe spent his life cultivating an image of dull, bourgeois respectability to wash away the tainted blood of his house. He ordered the closure of the gambling dens and brothels of the Palais-Royal, attempting to scrub clean the sanctuary of vice his father had built. This act inadvertently marked the end of the era of aristocratic libertinage and ushered in the age of the closet, where sexual identity became a secret to be hidden rather than a privilege to be displayed, effectively dispersing Paris's first queer community from their only safe haven. It took more than 2 centuries for the true portrait of Philippe to be fully reconstructed through medical, cultural, and scientific lenses. Modern genetic analysis of his living descendants finally dispelled the convenient myths of illegitimacy, confirming the Orléans line as true Bourbon. This scientific closure affirms that his tragedy was the result of conscious choices, not biological error. Ultimately, Philippe Égalité emerges neither as a saint nor a villain, but as a contradictory pioneer who dared to live authentically amidst a volatile era. He stands as the first proof that the personal is political, and his defiant stoicism in the face of death remains a lasting declaration of the right to live a multidimensional life without regret, leaving behind the echo of a man who dared to be everything at once.